The Romans gave us aqueducts, roads, and law, but they also gave us something far more scandalous. Behind the marble columns, beneath the painted frescoes, in the shadow of temples, the people of ancient Rome practiced rituals so shocking that the church later tried to erase them from memory. These weren't just private indulgences, they were ceremonies, festivals, and rites tied to God's power and passion. So, let me ask you, what would you do if you stumbled into a Roman feast where intimacy was not only allowed, but demanded, where priests and priestesses guided acts you'd never expect to see in a temple? Tonight, we'll step into that forbidden world, and by the end, you may never look at ancient Rome the same way again. And before we pull back the curtain, you're watching Whispers of History, where we uncover the secrets the past tried to bury. Make sure to subscribe, because what you're about to hear is only the beginning of Rome's most hidden story. Now, let's begin. Roman society was steeped in ritual, and intimacy was never just a private act. It was tied to fertility, power, and the favor of the gods. One of the most famous festivals was the Lupercalia, celebrated in February. Young men, stripped nearly naked, ran through the streets, striking women with strips of goat hide. Far from being offended, women lined up to be touched, believing it would grant fertility. What began as a sacred rite looked, to later Christians, like pure scandal. But that was just the surface. Beneath Rome's official religion thrived secret cults, the kind whispered about even in antiquity. The Bacchanalia rituals devoted to Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy, began as small, harmless gatherings, but soon, Roman writers claimed they grew wild. Orgiastic feasts where men and women surrendered themselves to passion in honor of their god. Whether these accounts were exaggerated by moralists or not, one thing is certain: the Senate eventually banned the Bacchanalia, fearing the rituals gave people too much freedom, too much rebellion, and far too much pleasure. And yet, these rituals did not die. They slipped underground, practiced in secret groves and private villas. Imagine torchlight flickering in the night, drums echoing in the distance, wine flowing endlessly, and men and women dancing until they collapsed in one another's arms. These weren't just parties. They were believed to bring participants closer to the divine, to break the barriers between human and God through ecstasy. Even Rome's more respectable ceremonies carried undertones of intimacy. The cult of Venus celebrated not only beauty but erotic love. Offerings of flowers, perfumes, and even intimate tokens were left at her shrines. Some temples were rumored to have priestesses who performed sacred acts as part of worship. To the Romans, intimacy was not shameful but sacred, a way of connecting with forces greater than themselves. Of course, not everyone approved. Conservative senators railed against foreign practices brought from Greece, Egypt, and the East. They accused worshippers of dangerous decadence, of undermining Roman discipline. But their very outrage shows how widespread these rituals were. Rome was a melting pot of cultures, and with each new god, new practices arrived. Some embraced openly, others hidden behind locked doors. What makes this even more fascinating is how these rituals blurred the line between religion and politics. To participate in certain cults was to show loyalty not just to gods, but to secret societies that could wield power. Initiation often involved intimate acts, shared meals, and oaths whispered in the dark. In these spaces, intimacy was not just pleasure, it was allegiance. And here's a surprising detail. Roman writers tell us that some emperors themselves indulged in these rituals. Caligula, Nero, their names are infamous for scandal. While later historians may have exaggerated their debauchery, the accusations alone reveal what people believed possible. If the rulers of Rome themselves joined in, then forbidden intimacy was not just the pastime of the poor or the eccentric. It was woven into the empire's highest circles. Still, not all of Rome's rituals were wild abandon. Some were tender, symbolic, even playful. Lovers left carvings on temple walls, prayers for passion scratched into stone. Couples exchanged charms believed to heighten desire, mixing herbs like saffron and pepper into wine. Erotic art adorned bedrooms and bathhouses, not hidden but celebrated as a part of life. For the Romans, intimacy was not dirty, it was divine. But this freedom had its dangers. As Christianity spread, these practices were condemned with increasing fury. Temples were closed, cults suppressed, rituals outlawed. What had once been sacred was rebranded as sinful. And so, much of what the Romans practiced slipped into silence, surviving only in fragments of text and fading from. So the question is, were these rituals truly as wild as their enemies claimed, or were they exaggerated to justify suppression? Were they sacred ceremonies or excuses for indulgence? To find the answer, we have to step deeper into Rome's forbidden world, where gods demanded offerings of pleasure, where emperors blurred the lines between power and passion, and where the line between ritual and scandal was thinner than a silk toga. But before we dive into the shadows, tell me, if you lived in ancient Rome, would you have joined the torchlit Bacchanalia, risking scandal for ecstasy? Or would you have watched from the safety of the Senate steps? Share your thoughts below, and remember, you're watching Whispers of History. Subscribe now, because the secrets of ancient Rome are only just beginning to unfold. Step deeper into Rome's hidden world, and you'll find rituals that shocked even the Romans themselves. For while festivals like the Lupercalia were public spectacles, other cults practiced ceremonies that were secretive, intimate, and sometimes unsettling to outsiders. These weren't whispers of rumor, they were real, described in ancient sources, etched on temple walls, and hinted at in scandalous court cases. One of the most fascinating cults was that of Cybele, the great mother goddess, whose worship came to Rome from the east. Her priests, called Galli, were known for their ecstatic rituals, frenzied dancing, music, and acts of self-mutilation performed in the throes of divine madness. But what made this cult truly forbidden were the fertility rites tied to it. Ancient writers describe gatherings where intimacy was part of worship, blurring lines between priest and participant. Offerings of blood and passion alike were said to honor the goddess. Outsiders called it barbaric, but to worshippers it was sacred, a direct channel to the divine. Then there was Priapus, a minor god with a very major reputation. Statues of him, unmistakably exaggerated, stood in gardens and shrines. He was not only a symbol of fertility, but also protection. His image was believed to ward off thieves and evil spirits. Yet behind the humor, Priapus was also the focus of fertility rituals that involved explicit offerings. Some Romans left carvings and clay figurines representing male or female forms, asking for fertility or virility. Others offered food in shapes that left little to the imagination. For a society we often imagine as stern and disciplined, these rituals were shockingly open. And yet, intimacy in Rome was not only ritualized, it was theatrical. The Floralia, a festival in honor of Flora, goddess of flowers and spring, included performances by actors and dancers that left little to the imagination. Ancient accounts tell of comic plays where performers stripped on stage, mocking modesty, while prostitutes were invited to participate in the celebrations openly. For a few days each year, social rules loosened and intimacy became part of public entertainment. What might seem scandalous to us was, for the Romans, a joyful celebration of life and renewal. Rome's bathhouses also blurred the line between daily life and ritual. These sprawling complexes were not only places to wash, but social hubs where men and women mingled. Erotic frescoes decorated walls, and gossip hinted that more than bathing sometimes happened in secluded corners. Some bathhouses even had attached brothels, where intimacy was not only expected but openly commercialized. Roman writers like Martial and Juvenal joked about the liaisons that took place there, leaving us with a picture of a society far less restrained than the later Christian world would tolerate. But let's not forget the personal stories. The lives of individuals caught between duty and desire. One case recorded in a Roman court involved a noblewoman accused of sneaking into Bacchic rites, where she allegedly took lovers under the cover of religious ecstasy. Her family fought to silence the scandal, but whispers spread anyway. Another tale, perhaps exaggerated by moralists, tells of a senator's wife who supposedly joined a cult of Isis and engaged in ritual embraces as acts of devotion. Whether these tales were true or propaganda, their very existence shows how tightly intimacy and ritual were bound together in Rome. Authentic practices also appeared in marriage ceremonies. On the wedding night, some couples invoked Venus and Priapus, leaving offerings in their chambers. Small statues, lamps with erotic scenes, or charms carved with explicit images were placed near the bed to encourage fertility. Far from being considered indecent, these objects were normal reminders that intimacy was both a duty and a joy. Even ordinary citizens carved graffiti on walls in Pompeii celebrating their encounters, proof that love, desire, and humor were everywhere. Perhaps the most shocking element of Roman ritual was how public intimacy could be. During certain fertility festivals, couples were encouraged to display their closeness as an offering to the gods. While details varied depending on the source, the idea was clear. Intimacy itself was sacred, a way of ensuring crops would grow, families would prosper, and Rome itself would thrive. For us, these acts seem forbidden. For them, they were divine. And this raises an intriguing question. How did Romans balance this openness with the strict morality we sometimes associate with their laws? The truth is, Roman society was deeply contradictory. In one breath, the Senate condemned the Bacchanalia as dangerous excess. In the next, emperors built temples decorated with frescoes of gods and goddesses locked in passionate embrace. For Romans, intimacy was not hidden. It was a force of nature, celebrated and feared all at once. Of course, not everyone was comfortable with this. Conservative writers like Cicero and Livy warned that indulgence weakened discipline. They claimed that rituals celebrating ecstasy threatened the very fabric of Rome. And yet, those same critics wrote about these festivals in vivid detail, ensuring their memories survived long after the temples crumbled. And so we see Rome's forbidden rituals in their full paradox. They were joyful, scandalous, sacred, and shocking. They were outlawed by some, embraced by others, and remembered by all. But here's the twist. Rome's rituals weren't just about the gods. They were also about power. To join a secret cult was to align yourself with hidden networks, to gain favor, to find protection. Intimacy was not just an act of the body, it was an act of politics, loyalty, and identity. Which leaves us with a tantalizing question. If intimacy in Rome was both sacred and political, how far did its influence reach? Did these rituals shape the very rise and fall of emperors themselves? That's where we're headed next. Because some of the most infamous names in Roman history, Caligula, Nero, and others, were accused of indulging in rites so forbidden, so scandalous, that they still shock us today. But were they true, or carefully crafted rumors meant to destroy reputations? When you think of scandal in ancient Rome, certain names leap out like fire from a torch. Caligula, Nero, Elagabalus. Their reputations are soaked in rumor, whispered in disgust by historians who wrote long after their deaths. But behind the gossip lies a truth. In Rome, intimacy was not only personal or sacred, it was political. And nowhere was that more dangerous than at the heart of the empire itself. Take Caligula, for example. His reign, short and infamous, became a byword for excess. Ancient accounts accuse him of turning banquets into stages for intimacy, inviting guests to recline on couches and witness shocking displays between nobles and performers. Some claimed he even transformed parts of his palace into a brothel, where senators, wives, and daughters were encouraged to serve. Whether these stories are true or heavily exaggerated by enemies, They reveal what Romans feared most: a ruler who wielded sexuality as a weapon of humiliation and power. Then there was Nero, who saw theatre not as entertainment, but as life itself. He performed on stage, sang, danced, and forced Rome's elite to applaud. But whispers claim he also blended theatre with forbidden ritual. Ancient sources tell of festivals at his court where roles of husband and wife were reversed, where he married a freedman in a public ceremony, and where intimacy was staged as if it were a play. To moralists like Tacitus and Suetonius, these acts weren't just scandalous, they were signs of Rome's decay. But for Nero, they may have been about control. By breaking every rule, he showed that he was above them all. The most extreme case might be Elagabalus, the teenage emperor from Syria whose devotion to the sun god shocked Rome. He imported Eastern rituals, building temples where he insisted Roman elites take part in ceremonies that mixed religion with acts the Senate considered outrageous. Stories tell of him marrying multiple partners, both male and female, and even seeking surgery to transform his body. Was this truth or slander? Scholars still debate. But to the Romans, his reign embodied the fear that foreign gods and forbidden rituals could corrupt the very heart of the empire. Yet, even beyond the palace walls, scandal thrived. Senators, generals, and matrons all appeared in court records accused of joining forbidden rites. Some were said to have participated in mystery cults, secret initiations to gods like Isis or Dionysus that often involved symbolic intimacy. For those who joined, it was about transcendence, a way to connect with the divine. But for those outside, it looked like seduction, chaos, and rebellion. And make no mistake, intimacy in Rome was deeply tied to status. For the elite, taking lovers, male or female, was often overlooked, provided it did not disrupt politics or dishonor families. But when scandal erupted, it could topple reputations. One senator's career ended after accusations of participating in Bacchic orgies. A priestess of Vesta, sworn to chastity, was executed for breaking her vow, accused of consorting with multiple men. In Rome, the line between forbidden ritual and political disaster was razor-thin. What makes these tales so gripping is how sexual ritual became propaganda. Enemies of an emperor exaggerated his vices to justify rebellion. Historians painted rivals as immoral to prove Rome's decline. Scandal was a weapon as sharp as any sword. When later Christians wrote about Rome, they highlighted these stories to condemn paganism entirely. The result, a legacy where truth and rumor intertwine, impossible to fully untangle. But fragments of reality remain. Archaeology shows us erotic frescoes on the walls of Pompeii's villas, clearly meant to entertain guests. Graffiti records, jokes, boasts, and invitations that blur the line between humor and confession. Temples to Priapus, Venus, and Bacchus contain artifacts suggesting offerings tied to fertility and desire. These finds remind us that Roman intimacy was only slander in dusty texts. It was lived, celebrated, and, yes, ritualized in ways we can still trace today. Even the Colosseum, Rome's grandest stage, was not untouched by scandal. While remembered for gladiator fights, whispers claimed that after the games, the emperor's guests sometimes enjoyed afterfeasts where intimacy became part of the spectacle. Whether true or not, the very rumor reveals how strongly Romans connected spectacle, power, and desire. But here's the paradox. While elites indulged in forbidden rites, ordinary Romans were often judged far more harshly. A nobleman could boast of lovers, but a poor woman accused of the same risked ruin. Brothels were legal, but prostitutes were denied citizenship rights. Public festivals encouraged playful intimacy, yet private indiscretions could end lives. Rome's rules were not consistent. They were shaped by power, wealth, and status. So what do we make of it all? Were emperors truly as scandalous as history claims, or were they victims of political smear campaigns? Did forbidden sexual rituals really corrupt Rome, or did they simply reflect the same contradictions that always existed between control and freedom, duty and desire? Whatever the answer, these stories kept Rome's people talking. They filled taverns, inspired gossip in baths, and made their way into the writings of historians who wanted to capture the rise and fall of the empire in moral terms. Scandal became history, and history became legend. And as we leave the palaces of Caligula and Nero, the question lingers: what about the ordinary people, the citizens who weren't emperors or senators, but bakers, soldiers, and farmers? Did they too practice forbidden rituals? Did intimacy shape their lives in the same way or differently? That's where we turn next. Because in Pompeii, in Ostia, in the countryside of Italy, traces of everyday Romans show us that forbidden rituals weren't confined to the powerful. They lived in every corner of Rome, from taverns to temples, from graffiti scribbled walls to the charms hung above beds. So far, we've walked through the palaces of emperors and the secret groves of cults. But what about the ordinary Romans, the bakers, soldiers, tavern keepers, and wives who made up the empire's bustling cities? Did they too engage in forbidden rituals, or were these scandals reserved for the powerful? The truth is, intimacy and ritual were woven into the very fabric of everyday Roman life. And in some ways, the practices of common people were even more revealing than the excesses of emperors. Let's begin with the most obvious: the brothels of Rome. In Pompeii, archaeologists uncovered the Lupercalia, a two-story brothel with stone beds still intact. On its walls are frescoes depicting different acts, almost like a menu for customers. These weren't hidden away. They were proudly displayed, advertising services in explicit detail. Brothels were legal, taxed, and even regulated, which made them a visible part of Roman society. But they also carried stigma. Prostitutes were often enslaved or of low status, denied citizenship, and their names recorded with contempt. Yet despite the shame, the demand was so high that brothels thrived in every Roman city. Still, intimacy wasn't always transactional. In ordinary households, intimacy was tied to fertility, and fertility was tied to survival. Families hung amulets of festina, phallic charms believed to ward off evil spirits and encourage virility. These symbols appear everywhere, carved into doorways, painted on tavern walls, even etched onto children's jewelry. For Romans, the line between superstition and sexuality was thin. Protecting the home meant embracing symbols of passion. In kitchens and bedrooms, herbs played their role. Recipes in medical texts describe mixtures of saffron, pepper, and honey believed to excite the body. Women brewed teas of rue or pennyroyal, thought to prevent conception. Though risky, these concoctions show how everyday people sought to control their own intimacy, balancing desire with the realities of family size and survival. Then there's the graffiti, perhaps the most honest glimpse into Roman intimacy. On the walls of Pompeii, crude jokes, love notes, and bold boasts were scratched into plaster. One man wrote proudly, "I screwed the barmaid." Another carved, "Successus loves Iris, may she love him too." Some verses were playful, others explicit, but together they reveal a society unafraid to record its desires in public. Imagine walking down a street where the walls themselves whispered stories of passion, scandal, and longing. Even taverns doubled as sites of intimacy. Wine flowed freely, and many tavern keepers offered more than just food and drink. Some were connected to upstairs rooms where encounters took place. Wall paintings often showed erotic scenes alongside still life depictions of bread and wine, reminding patrons that pleasure came in many forms. Festivals, too, blurred the line between celebration and ritual. During Saturnalia, masters and slaves reversed roles, gifts were exchanged, and restraint was cast aside. Some sources hint that intimacy was part of the revelry, with boundaries between classes temporarily loosened. For 1 week each year, order gave way to chaos, and desire was woven into the fabric of festivity. But intimacy wasn't always playful. It was also weaponized. In Rome, accusations of adultery could be deadly. Husbands had the legal right to kill an unfaithful wife caught in the act. Women accused of infidelity faced public humiliation, exile, or worse. Men, on the other hand, were rarely punished unless they dishonored another man's household. This double standard shaped Roman intimacy at every level, forcing women to guard their reputations while men flaunted theirs. Still, women found ways to assert agency. Some wore charms said to arouse affection in their partners. Others turned to magical rituals, binding spells scratched onto lead tablets, buried in graves or wells, calling on gods to inflame the desire of a lover or punish a rival. One such tablet reads, "Burn with passion, Sicilia, until you come to me." These weren't isolated acts. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of such spells, proof that ordinary people used magic to control love and intimacy. And in the countryside, farmers tied fertility directly to the land. Plowing, sowing, and harvest rituals often carried sexual symbolism. In some regions, couples lay together in fields as part of ceremonies to ensure a good crop. Livestock, too, were included in fertility rites, with symbolic offerings to guarantee abundance. To us, these acts seem shocking. To them, they were survival. Intimacy as a contract, not only between people, but between humans and nature itself. Bathhouses, the great social hubs of Rome, also played their part. While officially places for cleansing and relaxation, their atmosphere encouraged closeness. Men and women bathed in separate areas, but gossip claimed that in certain establishments, mixed bathing occurred, sparking both scandal and allure. Erotic mosaics and frescoes on bathhouse walls suggest that intimacy was never far from people's minds as they soaked, sweated, and socialized. And let's not forget the soldiers. Roman armies carried not only swords, but their desires. Camps along the frontiers often attracted camp followers, women who provided food, company, and sometimes more. Graffiti in military outposts shows soldiers carving crude jokes about their encounters. These moments, though fleeting, remind us that even at the edge of empire, intimacy followed wherever Rome marched. All of this reveals a powerful truth. Forbidden sexual rituals weren't just for emperors and elites. They were part of everyday Roman existence, woven into marriages, taverns, festivals, and farms. Intimacy was sacred, playful, dangerous, and necessary, a force that shaped family, fertility, and survival itself. So here's the question. If intimacy was everywhere in Rome, why did later generations paint the empire as uniquely decadent? Were Romans truly more indulgent, or were they simply more honest about what people everywhere have always done? That's what we'll explore next. Because the real story isn't just about what rituals Romans practiced. It's about how those rituals were remembered, distorted, and weaponized. In Part 5, we'll uncover how forbidden intimacy became the ultimate symbol of Rome's moral decline, and how its memories shaped centuries of history that followed. But before we step into the myths of decadence, I'll ask you, if you were walking the streets of Pompeii and saw the graffiti, the charms, the frescoes, would you join in Rome's openness, or would you recoil at the frankness of it all? By now, we've seen how Roman intimacy was everywhere, in temples, in taverns, in palaces, and in private homes. But here's the twist. Much of what we know about these practices doesn't come from the people who celebrated them. It comes from their enemies. And those enemies painted a picture so lurid, so shocking, that Rome's sexuality became forever tied to its supposed moral collapse. When Rome began to struggle, under corrupt emperors, foreign invasions, economic strain, writers needed someone to blame. And what better target than the very festivals and rituals that seemed to flaunt excess? If the empire was failing, surely it was because people had become too indulgent, too shameless, too obsessed with pleasure. the narrative of decadence was born. Take the Bacchanalia. Earlier, we saw how these rites to Bacchus blended wine, ecstasy, and intimacy. But by the time Livy, the historian, wrote about them, the rituals had transformed into something monstrous in the Roman imagination. He described cult members meeting in secret at night, engaging in wild orgies, conspiring against the state, even committing murders under cover of ritual. Was this accurate? Almost certainly not. Livy was writing long after the Senate had already outlawed the Bacchanalia, turning history into moral lesson. For him, the message was clear. Rome nearly fell because it let forbidden pleasures run rampant. And consider the emperors. Caligula and Nero may have been extravagant, yes, but much of what we know about their sexual scandals comes from hostile sources. Suetonius, Tacitus, and later Christian writers had every reason to exaggerate. The wilder the story, the more it proved their point. Rome had lost its discipline. That's why, even today, their names still echo with scandal. But we must ask, were these tales history or carefully crafted propaganda? Christianity, too, played a massive role in reshaping Rome's memory. Early Christians saw themselves as moral reformers in a world of corruption. To them, Rome-esque temples filled with erotic frescoes and fertility charms weren't holy, they were sinful. By condemning pagan practices as depraved, Christian leaders strengthened their own moral authority. What better way to show the superiority of the new faith than to label the old one obscene? And so, the image of Rome as a city of orgies and excess became central to its downfall narrative. Church fathers like Augustine pointed to sexual immorality as evidence that Rome had collapsed under its own weight. Pagan festivals were rebranded as symbols of decadence, their sacred meanings erased. Fertility charms, once thought protective, became vulgar reminders of idolatry. But archaeology tells a different story. Excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum reveal erotic art displayed openly in homes and taverns, not as hidden shame, but as humor, charm, or devotion. These frescoes weren't evidence of collapse, they were part of life. Likewise, the fertility rituals tied to Cybele, Venus, and Priapus weren't orgies of chaos, but structured ceremonies meant to ensure survival. Yet centuries of propaganda painted them as dark, forbidden acts. This rewriting of history shaped how later generations viewed Rome. During the Renaissance, artists rediscovered erotic Roman frescoes buried at Pompeii and were shocked. Some museums even locked away explicit Roman artifacts in so-called secret cabinets, accessible only to select scholars. The narrative of decadence endured. To many, Rome was not just the empire of roads and law, it was the empire of excess, destroyed by its own forbidden pleasures. But here's the question: was Rome really undone by intimacy, or is that just the story later writers wanted us to believe? After all, empires fall for many reasons: war, economics, politics. Blaming sexuality is simple, powerful, and convenient. It makes history a morality tale. But reality is always more complicated. Think of it this way. If you wanted to undermine an enemy, what better weapon than scandal? Whisper that your rival joins secret cults, engages in forbidden rituals, seduces senators' wives. Suddenly, their power crumbles without a sword being drawn. In Rome, accusations of sexual excess weren't just gossip, they were political daggers. This strategy didn't end with Rome. For centuries afterward, rulers accused their enemies of forbidden intimacy to discredit them. The legacy of Roman scandal became a template for moral propaganda. Rome's sexual rituals, whether real or imagined, became cautionary tales told again and again. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a paradox. The Romans themselves saw intimacy as sacred, natural, even necessary for survival. Yet the memory of their rituals became twisted into warnings of excess, decadence, and doom. Reality was earthy, practical, even joyful. But history remembered only the scandal. And maybe that's why Rome's story continues to fascinate us. Because it forces us to ask, how much of what we think we know is truth, and how much is propaganda? Were Romans really more indulgent than anyone else? Or were they simply more open, more honest about what humanity has always done? As we prepare to step into the final parts of our journey, this is the thread we'll pull. Because the forbidden rituals of Rome aren't just about sex or scandal. They're about memory, power, and the way history itself is written. But before we dive into Rome's ultimate legacy, tell me, do you think empires truly fall because of morality, or is that just the story we tell ourselves afterward? When the temples of Rome closed and Christian crosses rose over the empire, it might seem that the forbidden rituals of the old gods disappeared forever. Statues of Priapus were toppled, shrines to Venus were abandoned, and the frenzied dances of Bacchus faded into silence. But history is never that simple. What looks like an ending is often only a transformation. And Rome's intimate rituals didn't vanish. They lingered, reshaped, and repurposed, hidden in festivals, folklore, and secret societies. Take the festival of Lupercalia. You remember the February rite where nearly naked men ran through the streets, striking women with strips of goat hide to bless them with fertility. The church condemned it as pagan excess, and yet echoes of it survived. Some scholars argue that Valentine's Day, with its themes of love and fertility, grew from the ashes of Lupercalia. The public whipping faded, but the celebration of passion remained. A festival once tied to fertility charms and ritualized desire became, over centuries, a Christian feast of romance. Or consider Saturnalia, Rome's wild winter celebration where masters and slaves reversed roles. Gifts were exchanged, and social order crumbled into joy and excess. When Christianity spread, Saturnalia was officially outlawed. But its customs, feasting, gift-giving, revelry in the darkest days of the year, lived on. Today, we see them in Christmas and New Year's traditions. The intimacy may have softened into family gatherings, but the spirit of release, of loosening restraint, is still there. Even the cults that once shocked Rome left their fingerprints. The mystery religions of Isis, Cybele, and Dionysus, with their secret initiations and symbolic intimacy, may seem long gone. But medieval Europe had its own underground societies, groups accused of heresy, witchcraft, and forbidden rites. The Church often described them in language strikingly similar to the accusations once hurled at Roman cults. Secret gatherings at night, ecstatic dances, intimacy framed as blasphemy. Were these echoes of the old rituals, or simply the same human urges finding new expression? Either way, the memory of Rome's forbidden ceremonies haunted Europe for centuries. The imagery of Priapus, too obscene for Christian sensibilities, didn't vanish entirely. In rural Italy, amulets in the shape of the fascinum, the protective phallic charm, continued to be used well into the Middle Ages. Farmers hung them in fields to ward off evil and ensure fertility. Mothers tied them to children to protect against the evil eye. What once decorated shrines to Priapus now hid quietly in folk superstition, passed down through generations long after the god himself was forgotten. And what about erotic art? Pompeii's frescoes shocked the Renaissance scholars who unearthed them in the 18th century. They locked them away in the secret cabinet of the Naples Museum, fearing they were too indecent for public eyes. But despite censorship, these images influenced artists and thinkers, sparking fascination with Rome's open embrace of desire. Rome's forbidden rituals became symbols of both danger and allure, something to be hidden, yet also secretly admired. Even Europe's later festivals carried Roman shadows. Carnival, with its masks, feasting, and temporary suspension of morality before Lent, echoes Saturnalia's reversal of order. May Day celebrations, with dances around poles and fertility themes, recall Rome's rural rituals of planting and harvest. In each case, the wildness of Roman intimacy lived on, dressed in new costumes, but carrying the same heartbeat of desire and release. But the legacy wasn't only festive, it was also intellectual. Renaissance humanists, rediscovering ancient texts, debated whether Rome's openness about sexuality represented corruption or wisdom. Some saw it as a warning, others as liberation. Writers and philosophers wrestled with the question, was Rome destroyed by forbidden passion, or was passion part of its greatness? That debate shaped not only history, but how Europe thought about morality, intimacy, and power for centuries to come. And beneath the surface, secret societies whispered old patterns, from medieval heretical groups accused of orgiastic rites, to Renaissance occultists who revived Roman deities. The specter of forbidden intimacy remained a potent accusation, and sometimes a reality. The idea that intimacy could be sacred, magical, or transformative never fully died. It simply went underground, waiting for moments when society loosened its grip. So you see, Rome's forbidden sexual rituals didn't vanish with the fall of the empire. They shifted, resurfaced, and left echoes that shaped festivals, art, superstition, and scandal long after the last emperor fell. They remind us of a truth that history often hides. Desire is resilient. Suppress it, condemn it, outlaw it, and it finds another way to survive. Which raises a fascinating question. If Rome's intimacy lived on, disguised as Valentine's Day, Christmas revelry, and folk charms, how much of our modern world still carries traces of rituals we would call forbidden? When you exchange a Valentine, light a Christmas candle, or dance at a festival, are you unknowingly echoing Rome? In the next and final part of our journey, we'll bring it all together. We'll ask what Rome's forbidden rituals truly reveal about humanity, about our fears, our pleasures, and the way history transforms desire into legend. We've wandered through torchlit temples and noisy taverns, into the palaces of emperors and the back alleys of Pompeii. We've watched priests of Cybele whip themselves into frenzy, seen couples slip tokens beneath their pillows for fertility, and imagined senators whispering accusations of scandal in the marble halls of power. From Bacchus' secret rites to Priapus' crude charms, from public festivals to private spells, intimacy in Rome was everywhere, sacred, scandalous, and unforgettable. But what do these forbidden rituals truly tell us? Was Rome destroyed by decadence, as its critics claimed? Or was it simply a civilization that dared to embrace openly what others hid in shadows? The truth is complicated. Intimacy in Rome was never just about pleasure. It was about fertility, survival, power, politics, and faith. It was a tool wielded by emperors, a weapon used in propaganda, a source of joy for families, and a risk that could topple reputations. For the Romans, desire was not shameful. It was divine, but also dangerous. And yet, as we've seen, the story of Rome's sexuality didn't end with the empire's fall. It lived on, reshaped into festivals, hidden in superstition, rediscovered in art, and retold as cautionary tales. The church tried to bury it, historians turned it into moral warnings, but the echoes never disappeared. Even today, when we celebrate Valentine's Day, decorate for Christmas, or scribble graffiti on bathroom walls, we are, in small, unexpected ways, walking with the ghosts of Rome. So perhaps the most enduring truth is this: intimacy is unbreakable. Suppressed, censored, ridiculed, it still finds a way. From the sacred groves of Bacchus to the stone beds of Pompeii's brothels, from the whispered love spells of ordinary women to the scandalous feasts of emperors, intimacy was always there, pulsing beneath the surface of Roman life, and it remains with us still. Think about it. Rome's engineers built roads that connected an empire, but its rituals revealed something deeper. The roads inside the human heart, the desire to connect, to feel, to reach beyond the limits of rules and laws. That is the legacy of Rome's forbidden intimacy. Not collapse, not corruption, but humanity. Messy, passionate, contradictory humanity. And maybe that's why these stories still fascinate us. because they remind us that history is not only about battles and emperors. It's about whispered prayers, playful laughter, risky choices, and rituals that blur the line between sacred and profane. It's about us, who we were, who we are, and who we always will be. So the next time you hear someone say, Rome fell because of decadence, remember this: that story says more about the storytellers than about Rome itself. The empire fell for many reasons: politics, war, economics, but it's intimacy that didn't destroy Rome. It kept Rome alive, and it still lives in us today. Now, I'll leave you with a final question. If you had lived in ancient Rome, surrounded by festivals where rules dissolved, temples where desire was sacred, and secret societies where forbidden rites promised closeness to the gods, would you have joined? Would you have risked everything for ecstasy, or stood apart, clinging to discipline? Tell me in the comments. I can't wait to read your thoughts, because every perspective adds a new layer to this story. And remember, you've been watching Whispers of History. If this journey through Rome's forbidden secrets fascinated you, make sure to subscribe. We explore the past not as dry dates and names, but as whispers. Whispers that reveal how people lived, loved, and dared in ways more familiar than we might expect. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, let the flicker of torchlight guide you back to Rome. Hear the laughter of Saturnalia, the drums of Bacchus, the quiet scratching of a love spell on a lead tablet. And know this: history is never gone. It breathes through us, it shapes us, and it whispers to us still.